Sometimes the person who quietly waits for you is the one you never realize you cannot live without. I never expected an ordinary Friday night to become the moment that divided my life into two completely different chapters. Until then, everything between Noah Carter and me had always been simple. We were roommates, nothing more. For 3 years we had shared apartment 4B on the west side of Portland, splitting rent, arguing over whose turn it was to buy groceries, laughing about burned dinners, and pretending that the tiny apartment somehow felt much larger than it actually was. Noah worked for a marketing agency downtown, while I spent most of my days illustrating children's books from the small studio corner beside our living room window. We lived different lives under the same roof, yet somehow our routines fit together so naturally that neither of us ever questioned them. There was only one truth I never allowed myself to forget. Noah was straight, and I had been secretly in love with him for longer than I cared to admit. Those feelings stayed locked behind ordinary conversations, shared meals, and casual smiles because losing him as a friend always seemed far more frightening than never being loved in return. That afternoon felt completely normal. Soft music played through the apartment while I adjusted colors on the final illustration for a new picture book. A tray of fresh cinnamon rolls cooled on the kitchen counter, filling every room with a warm scent that always reminded me of weekends at home. Around lunchtime, my phone buzzed. Noah had sent a message that simply read, "Dinner with Melissa tonight. Wish me luck." I smiled before answering. "You will be fine. Do not forget to save room for dessert." He replied with a laughing emoji, and I placed my phone back on the desk, quietly reminding myself that hoping for his happiness meant accepting that it might never include me. Evening arrived beneath dark clouds that slowly swallowed the last colors of the sky. By 9 o'clock, heavy rain struck the apartment windows so hard that the streetlights outside became blurred streaks of gold. I assumed Noah would probably stay at Melissa's place after dinner. So I returned my attention to my drawing tablet, determined to finish one last illustration before going to bed. Then I heard the sound of keys fumbling awkwardly against the front door. Something immediately felt wrong. Noah never came home quietly. Normally, he filled the apartment with energy before he even stepped inside, calling my name from the hallway or complaining about traffic with exaggerated frustration. Tonight, the door opened slowly. He stood motionless just inside the entrance wearing a navy jacket soaked by rain, blonde hair dripping onto the hardwood floor, shoulders lowered beneath a weight that seemed far heavier than the storm outside. He did not even notice I was watching him. He simply stared at the floor as though he no longer recognized the place he had called home for years. I quietly set my tablet aside and walked toward him. "Noah." He lifted his head. His blue eyes looked tired, distant, and painfully empty. He forced a small smile that disappeared almost immediately. "Hey." My heart tightened. "What happened?" He let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like a laugh, except there was no happiness inside it. "Melissa ended things." The words hung heavily between us. I searched for something comforting to say, but every sentence felt too small for the hurt written across his face. "I am so sorry," I whispered. He nodded once before slipping off his wet shoes and walking into the living room. Rain continued tapping against the windows while silence settled over the apartment. After several long moments, he slowly sat beside me on the couch, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. He stared ahead, breathing deeply as though trying to hold himself together. Finally, he turned toward me with an expression so vulnerable that it nearly broke my heart. "Ethan," he said quietly, "could you stay with me tonight? I really do not want to be alone." I looked at Noah for only a second before closing my drawing tablet and setting it carefully on the coffee table. There were countless questions I wanted to ask, but none of them felt as important as the quiet fear in his voice. He was not asking me to solve his problems. He was simply asking me not to leave him alone. "Of course," I answered without hesitation. Relief softened his expression almost immediately, and for the first time since he had walked through the front door, his shoulders relaxed just a little. "Thank you," he whispered. The apartment grew quiet again except for the steady rhythm of rain tapping against the windows. I stood and walked into the kitchen, partly because I wanted to make him something warm and partly because I needed a moment to calm the emotions racing through my own heart. I reheated the cinnamon rolls I had baked that afternoon, poured 2 mugs of coffee, and added extra cream to Noah's cup without even thinking. Some habits became second nature after living with someone for 3 years. When I carried everything back into the living room, Noah had changed into an old gray sweatshirt and comfortable sweatpants. His damp hair still clung to his forehead, and the exhaustion on his face made him look older than 27. He accepted the warm plate with a grateful smile. "You saved these for me?" he asked quietly. I shrugged. "I always make enough for both of us." He looked down at the cinnamon roll before laughing softly. "I never noticed. That is because you usually eat them before they have time to cool." A real smile finally appeared, small but genuine, and somehow the entire apartment felt warmer because of it. We sat together on the couch without turning on the television. Neither of us seemed interested in filling the silence with background noise. After several minutes, Noah rested his elbows on his knees and stared toward the rain-covered window. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Anything." He took a slow breath before speaking. "How do you know when someone stops loving you?" The question settled heavily between us. I looked into my coffee for a long moment before answering honestly. I do not think there is always one moment. Sometimes people leave long before your heart understands that they already have. Noah nodded slowly. "Melissa told me she still cared about me." He paused. "She just could not picture a future anymore." His voice remained calm, but the sadness beneath it was impossible to miss. "I keep wondering what I did wrong." I turned toward him. "Maybe you did not do anything wrong." He looked at me with tired eyes. "Then why was I not enough?" I wanted to tell him that he had always been enough. That he was thoughtful, kind, dependable, and the easiest person I had ever loved. But those words belonged to a truth I had promised myself never to reveal. Instead, I quietly said, "Sometimes two good people simply grow toward different futures." Noah studied my face for several seconds before giving a faint nod. "You always know how to make things sound a little less painful." I smiled gently. "I wish I actually knew how." He leaned back against the couch and closed his eyes for a moment. "I really did not want to spend tonight by myself." "You are not by yourself," I replied softly. "Not tonight." He opened his eyes again and looked at me with quiet gratitude. We eventually put on an old comedy we had watched together more times than either of us could count. Neither of us paid much attention to the movie. Noah laughed at familiar scenes, and every now and then he glanced toward me as though making sure I was still sitting beside him. Around 1 in the morning, his laughter faded into slow, steady breathing. He had fallen asleep with his head resting gently against my shoulder. I remained perfectly still, afraid that even the smallest movement might wake him. Outside, the storm slowly drifted away into the darkness. Inside our tiny apartment, I realized something had already begun to change. Noah had asked me to stay because his heart was broken, but somewhere deep inside my own heart, I quietly wished he would never stop needing me to be there. The next morning's sunlight slipped quietly through the living room curtains, painting soft golden lines across the floor. I woke carefully, realizing Noah was still asleep beside me with his head resting lightly against my shoulder. For a brief moment, I simply sat there, listening to the peaceful rhythm of his breathing and wishing time would stand still. It was the closest we had ever been, yet nothing about the moment felt awkward. It felt natural, almost as though life had been quietly leading us. Here all along. Eventually Noah stirred and lifted his head, blinking as he looked around the room before realizing where he had fallen asleep. A faint blush colored his face. "I am sorry," he said with an embarrassed smile. "I did not mean to use you as a pillow." I laughed softly. "You looked comfortable. I did not want to wake you." He rubbed the back of his neck. "You probably barely slept." "It was worth it." He looked at me for a second, his expression unexpectedly warm, before quietly saying, "Thank you for staying." We moved into the kitchen together, where Noah insisted on making breakfast even though he had always admitted my pancakes were much better than his. I leaned against the counter while he unsuccessfully tried to flip one without folding it in half. "You are definitely laughing at me," he said. "Only because this is becoming a disaster. I thought cooking was supposed to be relaxing, not when you are involved." He pointed the spatula at me with exaggerated offense before both of us burst into laughter. It was the first genuine laugh I had heard from him since the breakup, and hearing it somehow made the apartment feel brighter. After breakfast, I carried my coffee to the small workspace beside the living room window where I usually spent weekends illustrating children's books. I expected Noah to disappear into his bedroom or head out with friends, but instead he walked over holding the mystery novel he had been reading for weeks. Would it bother you if I stayed here while you worked? He asked. I looked up with surprise. Do not you normally play basketball on Saturday mornings? He shrugged casually. The game can wait. I smiled and pointed toward the old armchair near the window. Then make yourself comfortable. He settled into the chair while I returned to my drawing tablet. Soft, instrumental music drifted through the apartment, interrupted only by the occasional turning of a page or the sound of my stylus against the screen. Every so often I glanced toward Noah, only to discover he was not actually reading. More than once I caught him quietly watching me work. Around lunchtime, I finally smiled without looking away from my sketch. You have been on the same page for nearly 40 minutes. He lowered the book and laughed. Maybe I am distracted. By what? He hesitated before answering with a small shrug. I never realized how interesting your work is. I laughed. Watching someone draw for hours is not exactly exciting. Maybe it is when the person drawing enjoys it that much. His words caught me off guard. No one had ever paid attention to my work with such quiet curiosity before. That afternoon, we walked together to the neighborhood grocery store because our refrigerator contained little more than eggs, milk, and leftover vegetables. The trip should have lasted 20 minutes, but Noah kept stopping to point out coffee beans he thought I would like, fresh flowers that matched the colors in my newest illustration, and a bakery display featuring cinnamon rolls almost identical to the ones I had made at home. You really remember all the little things I like? I asked as we stood near the checkout line. He looked genuinely puzzled. Of course I do. Then he smiled in that easy, familiar way that always made my heart feel lighter. I guess I have been paying attention for longer than I realized. The following weekend arrived with clear blue skies and the kind of mild spring weather that seemed to pull everyone outside. Noah appeared in the hallway wearing a baseball cap, carrying 2 reusable shopping bags with a grin that immediately caught my attention. Come on, he said. We are going somewhere. I looked up from my sketchbook. Where? The farmer's market. I laughed. You spent the last 3 years telling me weekends were made for sleeping until noon. He shrugged with a playful smile. Maybe I finally found a better reason to wake up early. 20 minutes later, we were wandering through rows of flower stands, fresh fruit displays, artisan bread, and local coffee vendors while a musician played acoustic guitar near the entrance. Families strolled between booths. Children laughed while chasing soap bubbles drifting through the warm afternoon air, and everything around us felt wonderfully ordinary. Noah somehow managed to stop at almost every stand, asking questions about homemade jam, roasted coffee beans, and handmade pottery, even though we clearly did not need any of it. You know, we came here for vegetables. I reminded him after he sampled 3 different kinds of honey. He smiled without looking guilty at all. I am exploring our options. For breakfast. I teased. For life. He answered, making both of us laugh. We eventually reached a small bakery where an elderly woman handed us 2 warm cinnamon rolls wrapped in paper. As we thanked her, she looked at us with a gentle smile that seemed to notice something neither of us had fully understood yet. You two make a lovely couple, she said warmly. I almost dropped my coffee. We are just roommates. I replied a little too quickly. She nodded politely, although the amused expression on her face never changed. Whatever you call it, keep taking care of each other. That kind of partnership is rare. Noah simply thanked her before we walked away in comfortable silence. Neither of us rushed to correct the conversation again. A few minutes later, we stepped into a small independent bookstore tucked beside the market. I wandered instinctively toward the art section while Noah disappeared among the fiction shelves. After several minutes, I found a beautiful hardcover collection of watercolor illustrations. I carefully turned each page, admiring every painting before reluctantly placing the book back on the shelf. It cost more than I wanted to spend that month. You like that one? I turned to see Noah standing behind me holding 2 novels beneath one arm. It is beautiful, I admitted. Maybe another time. He gave a small nod, but said nothing else. We finished browsing, paid for our purchases, and walked home carrying bags filled with groceries, fresh flowers, and warm bread. Only after unpacking everything inside the apartment did I notice the watercolor book resting quietly on my desk. I looked toward Noah in surprise. You bought it. He glanced over from the kitchen while putting vegetables into the refrigerator. You kept looking at it. You really did not have to spend that much. He smiled with quiet sincerity. I wanted to. I held the book in my hands, unable to find the right words. It was not really about the gift itself. It was the fact that he had noticed something I wanted before I had even admitted it aloud. That evening we cooked dinner together, laughing when Noah accidentally added too much garlic to the pasta sauce. The kitchen was small enough that our shoulders brushed several times while reaching for ingredients. Neither of us stepped away. Every ordinary moment seemed to draw us a little closer. And somewhere deep inside, I began wondering whether the elderly woman had simply made an innocent mistake, or whether she had quietly seen the truth before either of us was brave enough to recognize it ourselves. By the time another week had passed, our apartment no longer felt like a place where two roommates simply happened to live together. It had quietly become the center of every part of my day. Noah no longer asked whether I wanted to have dinner because he already knew the answer. I no longer wondered whether he would come home before sunset, because somehow he always did. The little routines we had built together seemed so ordinary that neither of us questioned them. Yet every one of them carried a quiet meaning that was becoming harder to ignore. One Friday evening, after we finished washing the dinner dishes, Noah dried his hands with a kitchen towel before looking at me with an almost shy smile. "Come upstairs with me," he said. "To the roof?" I asked. He nodded. "The weather app says tonight has the best sunset of the month. I thought we should not miss it." I smiled without thinking. "You are starting to sound like a travel magazine." "Maybe," he laughed. "But I have learned that some moments are worth showing up for." We carried 2 folding chairs, a small container of homemade cookies, and sparkling water up the narrow staircase to the rooftop. The city stretched endlessly before us as the evening sky slowly transformed from bright gold into shades of orange, pink, and deep blue. Warm spring air drifted across the rooftop, carrying the distant sounds of traffic and laughter from the streets below. We settled into our chairs without speaking for several minutes. The silence never felt uncomfortable anymore. It felt peaceful, as though we had both learned that not every meaningful moment required words. Noah leaned back and looked across the skyline. "You know," he said softly, "I always thought coming home meant reaching this apartment." He smiled to himself before continuing. "Now I think it has more to do with the person waiting inside it." My heart skipped, but I forced myself to stay calm. "That is a nice way to look at it." He turned toward me with an expression that was thoughtful rather than playful. "Do you ever wonder how people miss something important even when it has been right in front of them for years?" I laughed quietly. "Probably every day. I think I do too." Another gentle breeze crossed the rooftop, lifting a loose strand of hair across my forehead. Before I could move, Noah reached over almost instinctively and brushed it gently behind my ear. His fingertips barely touched my skin, yet the tiny gesture seemed to stop the entire world around us. His hand lingered for the briefest moment before he slowly realized what he had done. Neither of us moved away. We simply looked at each other while the city lights below gradually flickered to life. I could see uncertainty in his blue eyes, but beneath it was something warmer, something searching for an answer neither of us had spoken aloud. My heartbeat became so loud that I wondered whether he could hear it in the quiet evening air. Noah slowly leaned a little closer, not with confidence, but with quiet curiosity, as though he was trying to understand a feeling that had grown without either of us noticing. I did not step back. I could not. Every ordinary breakfast, every grocery trip, every shared laugh suddenly seemed to lead toward this single moment. Then the sharp sound of a phone ringing echoed across the rooftop. Noah blinked in surprise and quickly leaned back, reaching into his pocket. He glanced at the screen before answering with an apologetic smile. "It is my sister." I nodded, pretending the interruption had not completely unraveled the moment between us. While he talked with her about family plans for the following weekend, I looked out across the glowing skyline and tried to quiet the hope rising inside my chest. When the call ended, neither of us mentioned what had almost happened. We quietly folded our chairs, gathered the empty glasses, and walked downstairs side by side. In the narrow stairwell, our hands brushed together more than once while carrying our things, but neither of us apologized or pulled away. Somewhere between friendship and something neither of us was ready to name, the distance that had once protected our hearts had quietly disappeared. The rooftop stayed in my thoughts long after that evening ended. Every time I closed my eyes, I remembered the way Noah had looked at me before his sister called. I kept telling myself I had imagined everything, because believing otherwise felt far too dangerous. Hope was the one thing I had trained myself never to depend on. If I allowed myself to believe that Noah might feel something more than friendship, I could lose the one relationship that already meant everything to me. By Monday morning, I convinced myself that creating a little distance was the only responsible choice. I accepted an invitation to spend the next several weeks working from a shared creative studio downtown instead of illustrating from our apartment. It sounded practical whenever I explained it, but the truth was much simpler. I needed space before my heart made promises reality could never keep. I started leaving the apartment before Noah woke up and returning well after sunset. Every evening, I walked through the front door carrying unfinished sketches and pretending impossible deadlines had become my entire life. The first night I arrived home after 8 o'clock, I found 2 dinner plates waiting on the kitchen table. Noah looked up the moment he heard my keys. "You are finally home," he said with a smile that disappeared almost immediately. The studio kept me later than I expected, I answered while setting my backpack near the door. He glanced toward the untouched food. I waited because I thought we could eat together. Guilt settled quietly inside my chest. "You really did not have to wait for me." He nodded politely, but disappointment crossed his face before he looked away. Dinner became strangely quiet. We talked about groceries, the weather, and a funny advertisement Noah had seen on the train, carefully avoiding the growing silence that neither of us understood. After washing my plate, I excused myself and closed my bedroom door. Instead of drawing, I sat at my desk staring at a blank sketchbook, realizing that the distance I thought would protect me only made the apartment feel emptier than it had ever been. The pattern continued throughout the week. Morning coffee disappeared because I always left too early. Noah no longer sat beside my workspace reading while I illustrated because I was rarely there to begin with. Movie nights quietly vanished without either of us suggesting them again. Every routine that had slowly become part of our lives simply faded away. Friday afternoon arrived beneath gray skies, and while packing my laptop inside the studio, my phone vibrated. Noah had sent a short message. "What time are you coming home?" I smiled before I could stop myself and replied, "Probably around 9. "What?" His answer appeared a few moments later. "I was hoping we could have dinner together." I stared at the message longer than I expected before typing, "I will be there." When I finally unlocked the apartment door that evening, the lights were still on. Noah was sitting alone at the kitchen table with an unopened board game we had bought months earlier because we promised we would play it someday. He stood as soon as he saw me. "I almost thought you were not coming back tonight." I forced a small smile. I said I would come home. He studied my face for several quiet seconds before asking, "Ethan, did I do something wrong?" My heart tightened immediately. "No. Why would you think that?" He looked down at the table before speaking again. "Ever since the rooftop, everything has changed. You leave before I wake up. You come home after I am already waiting. You barely laugh anymore." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Yesterday I was cleaning your desk because I accidentally spilled coffee nearby." My breathing stopped for an instant. I saw a brochure from an apartment complex downtown. At first I told myself it probably meant nothing, but then I remembered how distant you have been all week. He finally met my eyes, and the sadness in his expression was impossible to ignore. "The thought of opening this apartment door one day and finding your room empty scared me more than I know how to explain. I thought losing Melissa was the hardest thing I would experience this year. Then I imagined losing you too, and suddenly I realized I could not picture this place, or my life, without you still being here." The apartment remained silent after Noah finished speaking. Rain tapped softly against the windows, almost echoing the storm that had brought him home weeks before. I looked at him across the kitchen table, realizing that every excuse I had prepared suddenly felt meaningless. "You did not do anything wrong," I said at last. My voice barely rose above a whisper. Noah searched my face, his expression filled with worry rather than frustration. "Then why does it feel like you are trying to disappear?" he asked. I took a slow breath, struggling to steady my thoughts. "Because I thought it was the only way to protect what we have." He frowned. "Protect it from what?" I looked down at my hands before answering. "From me." The words seemed to surprise both of us. Noah remained quiet, waiting instead of interrupting. "The more time we spent together," I continued, "the harder it became for me to pretend nothing had changed. I convinced myself that if I stayed close, I would eventually expect something you could never give me. I did not want to risk losing the friendship that has meant more to me than anything else." Noah slowly walked closer until only a few feet separated us. You really believed walking away would hurt less? I gave a small, uncertain smile. I hoped it would. He shook his head gently. It did not. His answer came so quickly that I looked up in surprise. Every morning you left before I woke up, the apartment felt empty. Every night, I waited to hear your keys in the front door. I kept thinking it was strange that I missed those little moments so much. He laughed quietly at himself. Then I realized they were never little moments to me. The room fell silent again. Noah rested one hand on the back of a chair and looked toward the window before speaking once more. After Melissa and I ended things, I thought I was grieving the future I had imagined. But this week taught me something completely different. He turned back toward me. The person I wanted to tell about every part of my day was never her. My heartbeat quickened. He smiled faintly, almost embarrassed by his own honesty. When something funny happened at work, I reached for my phone to text you. When I found a new coffee shop, I wanted to bring you there. When I came home, I listened for your music playing in the living room before I even took off my shoes. He paused for a long moment. I kept asking myself why the thought of you leaving scared me so much more than my breakup ever did. I could not find an answer because my own emotions had become too overwhelming. Noah stepped one pace closer, his expression calm but sincere. I still have a lot to understand about myself, he admitted. I am not pretending I suddenly have every answer. But I do know one thing with complete certainty. He met my eyes without hesitation. Home stopped feeling like an apartment a long time ago. Home became the person waiting inside it. I felt every wall I had carefully built over the years begin to fall away. For the first time since that rainy night, neither of us was hiding behind silence anymore. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The apartment felt impossibly quiet, as though even the rain outside had decided to wait. Noah's words echoed through my thoughts until I finally understood there was no safe place left to hide. I had spent years protecting a friendship because I believed it was all I could ever have. Now the person I had been protecting it for was standing in front of me, asking me not to disappear from his life. I drew a slow breath before speaking. There is something I should have told you a long time ago. Noah did not interrupt. He simply watched me with patient eyes that held more kindness than fear. I did not start working downtown because I wanted a different apartment, I admitted. I started because I was afraid. His expression softened. Afraid of what? I smiled sadly. Afraid that I had fallen in love with someone who could never love me back. The words finally escaped after years of silence. They were simple, quiet, and completely true. I have loved you for longer than I can remember. Long before Melissa. Long before that rainy night when you came home asking me to stay. Every breakfast, every grocery trip, every movie we watched together mattered to me far more than I ever admitted. When everything between us began changing, I convinced myself I was only imagining it. I thought stepping away would protect both of us. Noah stood perfectly still, absorbing every word without looking away. After a long silence, he smiled gently, almost as if something inside him had finally settled. Do you know what I kept asking myself this week? He said. I quietly shook my head. I kept wondering why losing you terrified me more than losing the relationship I thought I wanted. He laughed softly, embarrassed by his own honesty. At first I blamed the loneliness. Then I realized it was never about being alone. It was about coming home and not hearing your music, not smelling fresh coffee, not watching you draw by the window, not hearing you laugh when I burned breakfast. He looked around the apartment before meeting my eyes again. Every memory that made this place feel warm had you in it. My heartbeat grew louder with every word. Noah slowly stepped closer, leaving only a small distance between us. I cannot pretend I understand every part of what I am feeling, he admitted. But I know I stopped measuring my days by work or plans a long time ago. I measured them by whether I got to share them with you. I felt years of uncertainty begin to disappear. You really mean that? I asked quietly. He nodded without hesitation. I do. He carefully reached for my hand, moving slowly enough that I could have stepped away if I wanted. I did not. Our fingers met naturally, and neither of us spoke for several seconds. The moment felt gentle instead of dramatic, as though everything we had experienced together had quietly led us here. Noah smiled with unmistakable warmth. I asked you to stay because my heart was broken, he said. Now I am asking you to stay because I cannot imagine building my future without you in it. I laughed softly as emotion filled my chest. That is the easiest decision I have ever made. The rain outside finally began to fade, and warm evening light slipped through the windows. Standing together in the little apartment that had witnessed every ordinary moment of our lives, we both understood that nothing extraordinary had brought us together. It had been countless quiet days, shared routines, patient kindness, and the courage to finally tell the truth that turned the place we rented into the place we both called home. 1 year passed more quickly than either of us expected. Looking back, it was difficult to believe that everything had begun with one rainy evening and a quiet request not to be left alone. Life had never transformed into a perfect fairy tale, and neither of us wanted it to. Noah still forgot to replace the empty milk carton in the refrigerator, and I still left sketchbooks scattered across the living room whenever inspiration appeared without warning. We continued teasing each other about burnt pancakes, arguing over whose turn it was to buy groceries, and laughing whenever our tiny apartment became too cluttered with books, coffee mugs, and unfinished projects. The ordinary parts of life never disappeared. They simply became the reasons we smiled more often. One bright Saturday morning, Noah placed 2 steaming mugs of coffee on the kitchen counter before opening the curtains. Warm sunlight poured through the windows, filling every corner of the apartment with a familiar golden glow. "Your publisher called yesterday," he reminded me. "You are signing copies this afternoon." I smiled as I looked toward the bookshelf where the first printed edition of my illustrated children's book rested beside a framed photograph from our weekend trip to the Oregon coast. "I still cannot believe people actually bought it." Noah laughed softly. "I can. I believed in you long before everyone else did." His words settled warmly inside my heart because I knew they were true. He had celebrated every finished sketch, every difficult deadline, and every small success as though they belonged to both of us. After the book signing, we walked slowly through downtown Portland carrying fresh pastries from our favorite bakery. Nothing about the afternoon felt extraordinary, yet somehow it became one of those memories I knew I would never forget. We stopped at the same farmer's market where an elderly baker had once mistaken us for a couple. She smiled the moment she recognized us. "It is wonderful to see you two again," she said warmly. Noah looked at me before smiling back. "It is wonderful to be back." This time neither of us felt the need to explain anything. We thanked her, bought 2 cinnamon rolls, and continued walking beneath rows of colorful flowers while musicians played nearby. Everything felt wonderfully familiar, yet completely different because neither of us was hiding anymore. That evening we returned home just before sunset. As I unlocked the apartment door, my eyes drifted toward the new nameplate our landlord had recently installed after replacing the old one. 2 names stood side by side in simple black letters. Ethan Brooks, Noah Carter. I smiled quietly before stepping inside. Noah was already setting the pastries on the kitchen counter when he looked over his shoulder and said, "Welcome home." The words sounded ordinary, but they carried a meaning that reached far beyond the apartment itself. I walked over, smiling without hesitation. "It is good to be home." For a moment we simply stood together, surrounded by the comfortable silence that had always connected us better than endless conversations ever could. I finally understood that love had never arrived through dramatic gestures or perfect timing. It had grown through shared breakfasts, rainy evenings, grocery lists, quiet encouragement, long conversations after difficult days, and the simple promise of always coming back through the same front door. The night Noah asked me to stay, I believed I was helping someone recover from heartbreak. I never imagined that both of us were quietly finding the place where we truly belonged. Sometimes the happiest ending is not discovering someone new. Sometimes it is realizing that the person who has felt like home all along has been standing beside you, waiting for the moment when both of you are finally brave enough to stop pretending and simply choose each other every ordinary day thereafter.